You're listening to Talking to Teens, where we speak with leading experts from a variety of disciplines about the art and science of parenting teenagers. I'm your host, Andy Earle. We're here today with Dr. Cara Natterson talking about her book, Decoding Boys, the new science behind the subtle art of raising sons. Cara is a pediatrician, a speaker, a consultant, and New York Times best-selling author of multiple parenting and health books, including The Care and Keeping of You, which is a series for girls with more than 6 million copies in print, and Guy Stuff, which is the boys' version. She also founded Worry-Proof Consulting to give parents open-ended time to discuss what their own doctors can't squeeze into a visit. We're going to be talking today about how to handle silent boys who won't talk to you about what's going on with them. We're going to look at how to discuss body and puberty-related issues, sex and porn, as well as everything from violence to video games to Fortnite to lifting weights. Really excited to speak with Dr. Natterson today about her work and specifically about the importance of communication, about how much it matters to talk about these things and to keep the conversation going. And we're going to look specifically at why that is and how you can do that today on the show. Cara, thank you so much for coming on the show today. So talk to me a little bit about what inspired you to write this book. The book is Decoding Boys, New Science Behind the Subtle Art of Raising Sons. And this is not your first book. You've been writing about issues in this constellation for a long time, but now specifically you felt that it was time for a book on boys. Why is that?
Well, I think you probably have to kind of go back through my own personal trajectory to get to where I landed. So I'm a pediatrician and I was in practice for many years. And when I transitioned out of the practice of clinical medicine, I ended up moving into writing. And at first I wrote parenting books, but in 2011, I ended up joining forces with American Girl, the doll company, but also the relatively unknown publisher behind the cult classic book, The Care and Keeping of You, which is a body book for girls, walking them through what's going to happen to their body as they go through puberty. And I've spent the last 10 years working with them, and I had the opportunity to update the original book, and then we've written 4 more in the series. And from day one, I said to American Girl, what about boys? And my editor over there, who is a mom of a son, said, I know, right? But we're American Girl. So that's what about boys.
Right.
But she and I kind of had this 5-year, I wouldn't call it a battle because everyone was on our side, but a 5-year path to convincing everyone at the company that the process of growing up and transforming both in your body and your brain and your social world and your emotional life it's very not gendered, right? I mean, parts are parts, and probably about 20%, I would say, of the puberty process is gender specific, but the vast, vast majority is experientially the same. Doesn't matter what your gender. And so they gave in. And about 4 years ago, I published a book called Guy Stuff, which was The Care and Keeping of You for boys. And it was right in time for my own son to head into puberty. My daughter is 2 years older. When she saw that book come out, she was thrilled because her life was, sort of a mix of pride and humiliation when your mom writes the puberty books.
And right, so it's not going to have a bunch of stories about me in it. Yay.
Oh my God. The books came and she opened the box and she was so ecstatic. She flipped through one of the books and she said, Rye, come here. I want to read with you because now it's your turn. And of course, what I opened to was called the erection section. She was like, oh my God. But anyway, so I wrote guy stuff, and I was out on the road talking to families about guy stuff and publicizing guy stuff. And what became very clear to me, and at this point, my son was about 8 or 9, maybe a little older. And what became clear to me is that parents were having a vastly different experience raising their boys than they were raising their girls. And I've known this from practice, but it really, as someone who was out on the road talking to parents about a book written for their boys, what parents were begging me for was a conversation about conversation. Yeah. They didn't know how to talk to their boys. And, there's been a very palpable difference in the past 20 or 30 years in how we talk to girls about their bodies. Girls have gotten all this language and all this voice, and they talk about periods and they talk about boobs, and everyone's totally good with it. And in fact, parents expect their daughters to talk to them. And if their daughters don't talk to them, the parents sort of insist on it. Yeah. But there's no corollary for boys. And parents were sort of begging me to talk about that. And, I had a boy who was heading into puberty. And so it was personally very interesting to me, and it was professionally very interesting. And so I took on the challenge of writing a book, trying to understand why boys go quiet when they go into puberty and what we as parents can do to help them through it. Because language, as it turns out, is one of the single greatest resources that we have to keep ourselves safe and healthy.
And you talk in this book about how a lot of boys go quiet when they hit the puberty years, or there's at least a phase that's a silent phase, and they're just not saying that much, and that it is a phase, and they'll go through it and they'll come out of it on the other end. But you also write that we as parents don't necessarily have to accept their silence. And you write, if we fully accept our son's silence and don't insist on keeping a conversational thread alive, trust me when I say we'll face a much steeper climb when a heavyweight topic rears its head. What do you mean by not accepting their silence, and why do you say that?
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying there's always a parent who's listening who says, well, my son talks to me. He's totally verbal and we share everything. And so none of this applies. And I would argue that almost all boys go quiet to some degree. Yeah. The most talkative ones, maybe the volume comes down just a little, right, and they still talk, but it comes down a little. There are also a lot of girls that go quiet. So again, speaking to the point of not gendering, but my feeling about quiet at this point is that as parents, we are so conditioned to expect our boys to shut their doors and to shut us out, at least for some period of time, that when they do it, what we say is, oh, that's just puberty. That's what they do. Yep. Right? So I'm just going to ride this. I'm going to respect my son. Right. I'm going to give him his privacy. And when he emerges out the other side, then I'll reconnect with him. Yeah. And it's all going to be okay. When I talk to the boys don't want to be behind those doors all the time. I mean, don't get me wrong. Sometimes they really want to be behind those doors. Sure. And that's why you should always knock before you go in. But it is a very important piece of parenting advice. But, the reality is that most boys actually like being engaged by their parents, and they take their parents' silence not as respect, but as disinterest. Yeah. And it becomes a barrier to communication between parents and kids. And, that's a barrier you don't want to have to overcome if you don't need to, because there are big ticket items down the road, whether it's conversations around sex or drugs or friendships or stress and anxiety or, right? I could give you a list of 100 things. You want to have a relationship with any and all of your children where they can come to you and talk to you. If the modeling is, it's okay when you shut the door, I'm just going to leave you be indefinitely. Yep, right. That shuts down that conversational thread. And boys will often tell me they then try to find that somewhere else. One thing that parents are somewhat aware of as their kids become teenagers is they're talking to their friends.
Totally.
They're just not talking to you.
Right.
Right. And so what's that? And some of that is normal developmentally. That's what adolescents should do. But some of it is learned because they're responding to the behavior that you're putting in their direction.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily realistic to think that they're not going to resist these kinds of conversations. You know, people don't like to do things that are awkward and not fun. And so this is not necessarily something that your kids are just going to love and say, oh, thank you so much for bringing this up. This is great. Really appreciate it. But they're going to learn, if you don't, that all they have to do is put up a little resistance and you'll leave them alone. You won't press the issue. And they'll learn that they can kind of get out of stuff and how to, not engage with you about things that they don't want to talk about. And so, yeah.
Do not expect a gold star from your kid when you reach out to
Yeah,
not giving you that. But on the other hand, you are absolutely right that over time, it may take 5 or 10 tries on any given conversation, but over time, if you're a little bit relentless, kind but relentless, they will eventually realize you really care, and they'll start opening up. Some of them just a little, and some of them a lot.
This is not what you want from your parents, that they just never gave up on you. And even when you were kind of an asshole, they just kept at it. And
100%.
Yeah.
Right. And frankly, for your parent to be so honest with you that they can say, here's where I've behaved badly as your parent. Here's where you're behaving like a little jerk as my kid. Right. I mean, how do you say that in a loving way? Only honestly and openly if you have a dialogue. If your whole dynamic with your kid is lecturing them and it's a one-way street,
Yeah, right.
It doesn't work out very well when you're saying something that you think is loving and protective and they don't take it that way. So the back and forth so the first step is how do you talk to them? And the second bigger step is how do you listen, right? How do you talk with them? Instead of just, one direction.
So one of the big questions, I think, with regard to adolescence and puberty in general is, when do you need to start talking about it? When is the point of no return that it's too late now? And when does all this stuff even start? And there's kind of this folk wisdom that it's a lot earlier in girls. Girls kind of start this process a lot earlier and go through the growth spurt, and the boys are later on. And so maybe you're good, you can wait until your boys are maybe a little older, until you see their, maybe the hair start a little bit, the voice start to kind of break, the shoulders start to broaden, and the smell, you start to smell them, and then you're like, okay, now it's time to have the talk.
So let me break those apart and answer them all, because they're really good questions. The first is, if you have a kid in your life, if you're a parent, grandparent, trusted adult who has a kid in their life who is 15 and you're not talking to them, start talking to them. If you have a kid who's 12, start talking to them.
Yeah.
If you have a kid who's 7, start talking to them. If you have a kid who's 4, start talking to them. I mean, you're going to talk to a 4-year-old about really different things than you're going to talk to a 15-year-old about, but the idea of keeping open lines of communication is as important when they're little as it is when they're older. And if you haven't started, you're never too late. Let me just emphasize that 100 times, because that's the biggest sort of worry I get in response to telling parents to talk to their kids. Well, I've never done that. Did I miss the boat? No, you did not miss the boat. If your kid is 25 and you still haven't done it, you go, I probably should have done this a little while ago, but you know what? I'm just trying to be a great parent. So here we go. But start the conversations now. Puberty and when puberty begins and all that, it's a really, really big topic that I'll kind of boil down to a few sentences here. I write a lot about it in the book. But the take-home message is that it's a lot earlier now than it ever used to be.
Yeah.
The average age for girls in the United States to begin showing signs of puberty is between age 8 and 9. And depending upon ethnicity, Black girls in this country, if they are starting to develop breasts at age 7.5, that is considered normal. Boys, yeah. And boys, the onset of puberty is actually almost just as early. It is between 9 and 10, depending upon what your ethnicity is. And it didn't used to be that way. It has this timeline has marched backwards by a couple of years over the last 30 or 40 year chunk. And no, I don't know why. Whole other kettle of fish, probably everything in our environment, what we eat, what we drink, what we breathe. There are a lot of really smart people working on that. But it's important to realize a couple things about the earlier onset of puberty. One is that it's like taffy. So it's starting earlier, but it's not going any faster. And in fact, it's probably going slower because those landmark moments of puberty, particularly girls getting their first period, those moments have not really budged at all. So girls are still getting their first period around 12 and a half. But now they're developing breasts for, instead of 2 or 3 years before they get their period, it's 4 or 5 years. So this whole run up to these milestones of puberty is much slower, which is an interesting fact. The other thing, and I think equally interesting, is that most parents of boys have no clue that their boys are in it.
Right.
And that's because boy puberty is dictated largely by testosterone. Testosterone is just a hormone. It tells your body to grow and change so that you go from boy to man. Testosterone is manufactured in the testicles. Those are the testosterone factories.
Sure.
In order to get enough testosterone on board to go through full-fledged puberty, you got to get the factory up and running.
Right.
And that takes a little while. And so the first several months or even a couple of years of puberty in a boy might just be testicular growth, right? You don't see anything else. You don't see any broadening of the shoulders. You don't hear the voice change. Hair is a whole different issue. It's a little bit of a red herring because hair growth is actually not a marker of puberty. It just happens to happen at the same time as puberty, which is very complicated for people. Me too. It really throws you. But boy puberty happens way before we notice it. And I when I speak to audiences, I always have a parent in the crowd who's got a nudist who's running around at their house and they're like, oh, I knew when my kid was in puberty. But for every one nudist, there are like 99 completely private boys who shut the door and won't let you see them. And what I say to those parents is, that's fine. You do not need to know when they go into puberty. I am a pediatrician. I write about all this stuff. And even I didn't look when my son was starting to go through puberty. And trust me, I was tempted to understand it. That's very scarring. If you've got a private kid, your pediatrician can look. They can do an exam and they can tell you when your son is tipping into puberty. But it is happening a lot earlier than you think. And there's significance to that because the hormones don't just circle through the bloodstream below the neck. They go up into the brain and they circulate around the brain and they impact the way kids think and feel. And that, when you start paying attention, you go, oh yeah, I see puberty in the snarkiness, in the mood swings, and right, all that kind of stuff. And now you start to give yourself permission to recognize that your kid is on a new drug. And that drug is testosterone for boys. It is estrogen and progesterone for girls. And those are powerful.
And what about using those as to induce puberty in late bloomers? Or can you supplement with some of those hormones you're talking about when you have a kid who is getting into later teens and they haven't really started this process yet?
Yeah. I write a lot about late bloomers because we talk so much about what's happening earlier and earlier, but the kids who are on the later end, that's hard. It's socially really hard, right? Everyone around you has grown sort of in height, and all their features have changed and they look more adult, and here you are and you just look like a young child, and it's your brain is aging.
Yeah.
What you want to do is chronologically appropriate, but you don't look the part, and that's very hard. The definition of late bloomer for a boy is a boy whose testicles have not started growing by 14.
Okay.
And so what I say to parents whose 12 and 13-year-old boys, right, 7th and 8th grade, they look young, all the other kids seem to be changing, those kids aren't. I say to them, take your son to the pediatrician and have the pediatrician examine him. Because if his testicles are starting to grow, you're good.
Okay.
He's on the later end.
Yeah.
Right? If by 14, the testicles haven't started to grow at all, then sometimes you do need medical intervention. You need a little dose of testosterone to jumpstart the machinery. And it can be enormous. There are endocrinologists, hormone doctors for kids who will sometimes recommend testosterone younger than 14. And I think that's totally appropriate when that happens, because if you think about it, go back to your 8th grade self for a second, right? So not the most fun year. And now imagine being the only one pretty much who has just nothing going on physically. Yeah. That's pretty late to wait. And if the kid is starting to have some distress about it when he's 12 or 13, it's fine to take him earlier. And if someone deems it appropriate, to start thinking about treating him a little bit earlier, or to, proof that, hey, no, everything's working. It's just taking its time and we don't need to medically treat it, is very reassuring for a boy.
Because, wow, that seems like really detrimental to your just self-concept and your idea of who you are in the world, to be going through such a formative phase of your life, and feeling like you're sort of an outsider or not having the same experience as everybody else. Kind of.
I write a lot about the show Big Mouth, which is a very interesting show. I really like Big Mouth. I always say it's wrapped in an incredibly inappropriate set of premises, but it's, and the storylines are crazy and the language and the this and that. But at the end of the day, it's a story of an early bloomer and a late bloomer. And everything they put in that show is medically accurate. Every theme that they deal with. And they talk a lot about what it is to be a late bloomer. And it makes boys who they are when they're men in many ways, who have gone through the process. It definitely impacts the person they become.
Changes you forever. Yeah.
But it's hard. And, it's really an interesting path. You talk to late blooming guys as adults, and there's a large community online who talks about the experience, and it's pretty interesting to read. And the reason I point out late blooming boys especially is that girls tend to go through puberty earlier than boys. So the last of the last girls are done before the last boys even begin.
If you're the last boy in your class that go through puberty, you are just
hard.
Out there on your own.
It's hard. It's hard. Yeah. And this is what I always say. Okay. Being the first to go through puberty. Oh my God, that's so hard. Being the last to go through puberty. That's so hard. And being in the middle. Well, that's so hard. Right? Because it's puberty.
You have a really interesting section in here on brain changes that are occurring. And one thing that I marked was the limbic system versus the prefrontal cortex, and specifically the differences in myelination, and how myelination sort of starts in the center of the brain and kind of works its way out. So during the teenage years, you have this situation where, and I love this line, you say, that means if 2 messages are sent simultaneously, one to the limbic system and one to the prefrontal cortex, then in the tween or teen brain, the message going to the limbic system will arrive much faster, 3,000 times faster. That is a lot faster.
Explains everything about the decisions we make in middle and high school and college, right?
So when you're trying to figure out, what to do next, your emotions kicking 3,000 times faster than your logic, basically.
Yeah,
And so then
basically.
we as a parent say, what were you thinking? What was going through your head when you made this decision? I don't
Mhm.
know. That didn't happen until 3,000 times after the impulse to do the thing occurred. Yeah.
That's right. Whenever I teach kids about that, they're so happy. They go home and they're like, "It wasn't my fault.
Oh,
It was my brain." But that wasn't the point of writing that. I actually wrote that chapter so that kids in middle and high school could read it
Mm.
and understand what was happening in their brain, so that they could actually then start using tools to be able to think and make smart choices. So when you think about how fast a message is sent to the emotional part of the brain, and you compare it with how fast a message is sent to the rational part of the brain, how do you then get your brain to think rationally? You just give it time.
Yes.
And 3,000
Slow
sounds really
down.
high,
Yeah.
right? But if you count to 10, you're good.
Right.
If you are thinking about doing something really dumb and then you count to 10, your prefrontal cortex now has the chance to go, that is so dumb. Don't do it. Right.
Right.
And that's all we need kids to do.
Something really interesting in here is you said that as a pediatrician, you would often ask teenagers about what conversations they've had with their parents about these topics, and they pretty much universally say, nope, haven't talked about really any of this. Sex, nope. Body change, no, not really, haven't, no. But then when you ask the parents the same question, about 100% of them say, oh yeah, of course. We've talked about this stuff a lot. And I thought this was fascinating because the lab that I worked in before this, doing psychology research, we studied alcohol use. And we found the exact same thing with parents when we survey the teenagers and ask them, what have your parents told you about alcohol use? What are their expectations with regard to how much you're going to drink in college? All of these things, the kids are like, no, haven't really talked about it. Their expectations are that I'm going to probably drink a lot. They know it's college and etc. Then when we talk to the parents, they're like, oh, no, I've really clearly communicated. We've talked about this a lot. They know they're not supposed to do it.
Yeah.
And so I think there's just this disconnect in general with a lot of the communication between parents and teenagers, where we think that we're coming across to them. We think that we've communicated things to them, but they haven't really received it in the same way, or it didn't affect them as much as it affected us or something.
Yeah. So there are a few things here. I mean, one is we used to call the talk, it's supposed to be the talk about sex.
Yeah.
Well, the talk about anything doesn't work. It's sort of like when your child was a baby. Sometimes you had to try a new food 10 times before they would accept it.
Right.
So that's how I think about every conversation about everything important. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, I don't care what it is. You as a parent have to have it 8, 10, 12 times before it sinks in. And kids know that. It's not that they didn't hear it, but sometimes these conversations are horrifying. Sometimes these conversations are so PG compared to what they're getting from other mediums, right? They are so far beyond what you think
right.
you're shining a light on, right? Which is why it's important to listen and figure out where they are. But repetition is also critical. It really cues your kid that something matters to you. So if you've got a kid who's going off to college, and do you think you've done a great job having the talk about all the safety things and the drugs and the alcohol? It might be a good idea to have that conversation like 20 more times, or maybe have your kid tell you what you think.
Yeah. What have you understood about what I've told you? What
That's
do
right.
you think
That's
my
right.
expectations are?
That's right. And by the way, that is their prefrontal cortex talking. They are telling you using their rational brain what they know you want to hear. And then they go to the party, and it's not their prefrontal cortex that is working. It is their limbic system. It is the emotional center. And so the part that told you what you wanted to hear is not in charge until they're close to 30. And that is a really important conversation to have with them. Thank you for telling me exactly what you think I want to hear. Now let's talk about what you do in real life, because I want you to be protected.
We're here with Dr. Cara Natterson talking about how to decode teenage boys, and we're not done yet. Here's a look at what's coming up in the second half of the show.
You know, we've all got to acknowledge what they feel, whether or not it's what you feel, it's what they feel. And it takes a lot of bravery for them to share it. So if the first thing we do is shame them, we shut them down. I'm not anti-sex, and I don't write from that perspective. I'm just anti someone telling my daughter or my son that a great sex life involves lack of consent, pain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And frankly, for parents who are trying to figure out what tools can I give my kids so they can say no without feeling like an outlier, right? We've all been locked inside for a year in pandemic, and there's this fear that as kids break out of the house, it's going to be, kids gone wild, and right? How do I insulate my kid against bad decisions? Let them throw you under the bus. Let them say, oh my God, my mom drug tests me. Great. You, mom or dad, do not need any more best friends, especially 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old best friends. You do not need them. So let your kid make you look bad to save him or herself. And there are lots of those strategies, but that's probably my favorite is, dude, either I'm allergic to it, I'm on another medicine that's going to react to it, or my parents are crazy. They drug test me. I mean, I tell my kids to tell everyone I'm crazy. I really don't care what that is. That's what keeps them. And then they wink at me and they're like, yeah, we just tell them that. Because you're not crazy at all, Mom.
Want to hear the full interview? Sign up for a subscription today. You get unlimited access to all the interviews I've conducted. It's completely affordable, and your subscription helps support the work we do here at Talking to Teens. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.